Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and I would like to talk to you about lessons learned from the United Airlines Flight 232 DC-10 accident at Sioux City, Iowa. Now, if you've been involved in aviation for any length of time at all, you're very familiar with this accident. But I've got a couple insights I'd like to add because I personally know Al Haynes and Denny Finch, being fellow United Airlines pilots as myself. And also with my involvement as chairman of the New Aircraft Evaluation and Certification Committee for the Airline Pilots Association, where I got involved with some procedures and tests that were developed subsequent to this accident. Now, as you probably know, this accident occurred on July 19th, 1989. And the amazing thing was out of the 296 passengers on board, 184 actually survived. And this was attributed to be what's known as an impossible landing. And when this failure occurred at 37,000 feet, the fact that the aircraft simply didn't just roll over and crash is amazing. And if it had, nobody would have really blamed the crew, because in the olden days of hydraulic aircraft, when they're first coming about, you had the ability for manual reversion, like in the 707. But the hydraulic systems were determined to be robust enough, reliable enough, and you had 3 or 4 systems, so if you lost one, no big deal, you had a backup. Well, unfortunately, that didn't always prove to be true, and there were a number of accidents where there were problems with control, loss of hydraulic systems. Now, in the intervening years, several test programs were conducted to determine if there was an automated way to possibly control the aircraft that might be easier. Because to control the aircraft manually, there's a long delay in the response. And you have a situation like this where you have flight controls that are non-functioning. The aircraft enters typically what's a phugoid type of oscillation, and that has to be kept under control. A phugoid is a constant angle attack oscillation where the nose is lowering and rising, and you're trading kinetic energy for potential energy. And you can also have Dutch roll issues. So you have various modes of aircraft flight dynamics that need to be controlled. And kind of the difficult part of this is it takes a long time for the aircraft to respond. And then you also have engine response in there. So by automating it, it was actually determined that the aircraft could be made very flyable and actually successfully landed. Now, the reports are very detailed, and they looked initially at a whole bunch of aircraft, talking about F-15s, T-38s, all sorts of aircraft, trying to fly it just with engine thrust. And they settled on using an MD-11 and also a 747 to do the tests. Now, when I was a pilot on the DC-10, they put in the simulator this loss of all hydraulics, and we attempted to land the aircraft. Okay, well, yeah, it wasn't all that difficult. You could actually do it, but they gave you this situation on final. Okay, the aircraft is stable. You're on final. You're coming down glide slope. It's kind of like if you don't touch too much, you'll probably be okay and you land in the airport area. We're not talking necessarily a runway, but the airport area. I one time had a brand new second officer on the 27. We're going into Vancouver, and it's a Cat 2 day. We're down to a 100-foot ceiling, and I'm flying the 727. It's on autopilot, and when we get to decision height at 100 feet, I pick up the runway, I click off the autopilot, and I land. And the co-pilot says, the second officer says, "That was amazing. How did you do that?" And I said, well, it's very simple. The aircraft is trimmed. I click off the autopilot and I don't touch a thing. And then what I do is when I come in there and it looks like it's time to flare, I do the little check and roll flare, and it works out just beautifully. Now, in this flight, like I said, it took off from Stapleton at Denver, and it was en route to Chicago O'Hare. And near Sioux City, the fan section disintegrated, and it threw shrapnel through the tail and ended up bleeding all three hydraulic systems. Now, in the MD-11, they made an improvement, and they made some modifications to DC-10s also later on, but they made improvement with hydraulic fuses and that. And they did some isolation work on our DC-10s to keep you from having as serious, hopefully, of a situation as this. And, of course, the fan tore itself apart on the engine. And they ended up making a bunch of circles as they were descending to the airport. Now, like I mentioned, when they gave us in the simulator, they put us on final. Well, you are fighting this phugoid all the way down, and you're trying to maintain aircraft control. You're trying to get it near the airport. I mean, that's the hardest thing, is just getting to a position on final. You know, you give it to the guy on final, and yeah, you've got a good chance to make it. But they got around on final. And, of course, the aircraft, Denny Fitch is operating the engines to maintain control of the aircraft. There's a delay in the engine response. This is a picture of it on very short final. And as Al says, we were, you know, it looks, because it's a big airplane coming down, it looks like it's stable. And he said it was anything but stable. And as they're coming into what you would call the landing or flare. Now let me give you some numbers on this. It's pretty amazing. Okay, now remember, they didn't have any flaps. They couldn't get them out because they have no hydraulics. So they were coming down a final approach at 220 knots. Normal landing for an aircraft like this, for the DC-10, in a normal situation, is 140 knots. So they're doing 220 instead of 140. They were also coming down at a descent rate of 1,850 feet per minute. Normally, you're coming down at 300 feet, which you, of course, arrest to get a nice landing. So they hit pretty hard. And just before they were about to land, the aircraft started to suddenly roll to the right. And so what Denny did was he pushed in the engines to try to correct it. And unfortunately, the engines didn't come up in time, and they impacted on the runway. And the tower cleared them to land on any runway. And Al says, "Well, you're trying to make it that specific. They were just trying to land in the airport vicinity." And Al also told the controllers to keep them away from the town. Now, fortunately, they had good visual conditions. If this had been an IFR, it probably would have been totally disastrous. Now there's Al in the seat of the DC-10, the captain's seat. And Al is he's a great pilot. He had almost 30,000 hours at the time, and just a humble, wonderful guy. One of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. And he used his crew very effectively. This is probably one of the best examples of CRM, crew resource management, that existed. CRM had only been in place for a short time, and Captain L used all the facilities of the rest of his crew, especially Denny Fitch. L has passed away, and so has Denny. Denny, of course, went back to flying, as did L at United Airlines. And Denny has a son who flies for United Airlines, and I also have my son who flies for the airlines. And Denny came and operated the throttles, and that's really what pretty much saved the day, because he was essentially flying the aircraft. He had the only real control of the aircraft was with thrust. None of the control surfaces worked. Al had sent him back to look to see if the ailerons were doing anything, and they weren't. They had no hydraulics, no hydraulic pressure, and they were just there. This is a picture of the control column there afterwards, and the pilot's seat there. Now, one of the interesting things was it was 35 minutes. They were in this ball of wire, essentially. The cockpit from the outside did not look like the cockpit at all. And they were just essentially trapped in there, and it was 35 minutes after the accident before anybody realized they were there. And essentially, one of the guys stuck his hand out through a hole and waved a handkerchief at some of the people that he could hear by. And they realized that, hey, there are guys in there. And they survived. Of course, the accident site is just horrific, and there's stuff spread everywhere. The airplane, of course, if you've seen the video, it looks like it cartwheels, but it really doesn't. It's kind of an illusion the way it lands and the wing comes up. But it, of course, I've seen it hundreds of times, as I'm sure many people have. It just does not look good. Lots of pieces, lots of sections. Here's the midsection. Now, one thing I mentioned, Gordon Fullerton was the project pilot on this program. And he flew in one of the simulators, and I had a chance to fly the F-18 with Gordon out there at NASA. And he could fly the aircraft fairly well, the simulator, just with the throttles. And I had a chance to go in there with the NASA engineers and fly it, and I had a bit more trouble. This was a fixed base, didn't have motion, which probably would have helped a little bit, but I'm not doing as well as Gordon. And the engineer is kind of surprised, and I said, well, let me tell you something. If the only pilot you're used to working with is Gordon Fullerton, I got a shock for you. The rest of us are mere humans, and we're not as good. A lot of these guys could fly a bathtub, and some of them literally did. But a lot of these guys could fly very difficult aircraft and make it look great. And of course, the main thing, as I mentioned, is the phugoid and controlling that. So, the test reports are published. There is a system that you could put on the MD-11 and also the 747, and Airbus actually was working on this too. And you could install these systems in the flight controls so that if you had a situation like this, the aircraft would be flyable. The airlines didn't want it. It was going to obviously be a cost, training, and possibly maintenance thing, and they simply didn't want it. And, you'd say that was a bean counter decision that pilots would not have made, but the only comment I can make is that there really hasn't been a significant accident where this would have come to the aid that I can think of. So, the bean counters might have been right in this decision, but there was a capability to fly these aircraft using the flight control systems that was not adopted, and it's unfortunate. It might have possibly just been a nice little safety factor to have on board. Anyway, those are some of my insights. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.